Hello and welcome to Chopper's Brexit Podcast. As you can hopefully tell, I am not Christopher Hope. I am, in fact, Camilla Tominey, Associate Editor of The Telegraph. And I'm taking the podcast reins for Chris while he's on a well-earned break, having worked throughout the summer. So today we'll be reflecting on the week of chaos that we've just seen in Westminster and trying to unpick what exactly is going on and what it means for Brexit. Heaven knows whether we'll be able to answer any of these questions, but we'll certainly try. And what we're going to try and get to grips with is basically a week of chaos in, well, just under 30 minutes. And we are in very good company because I have with me here Tim Stanley, who is the Telegraph leader writer, my fellow Question Time panellist, and Peter Foster, who is our awesome Europe editor, who has had scoop of the week. So we're basking in his glory as we speak. Peter, Tim, how are you feeling as this hectic week in the Commons draws to a close? Tim first.
Absolutely exhausted. It is very complicated, but I think it's also very simple, which is that this government believes the only way that it can renegotiate with the EU and get a deal before October the 31st is if the threat of Britain walking away from the table without a deal is a credible one. Unfortunately for the government, a majority of MPs in the House are totally opposed to that, and that majority has very cleverly and successfully coalesced in order to take walking away from the table without a deal off the table. The government, in a panic, has said, right, we don't want an election, but to stop you from doing that, we will hold an election so that we can get a majority and be in power before October the 31st. The government has then tried to effectively close down Parliament and have an election instead. But the problem is we come back to that question of numbers. Because the government does not have a majority anymore in the House of Commons, it can't do it. So what's happened in the last week is it began with the government very much in the driving seat, but Remain MPs, I'm afraid, have taken control of the agenda and are now pretty much almost governing this country.
And Peter, you're so in tune with Brussels. What do you think the EU reaction has been to the events of recent days? You had this great scoop that I've already referred to in the Telegraph, where you basically revealed that Dominic Cummings, who is Boris Johnson's chief strategist, his chief of staff, had been describing the idea of holding negotiations with Brussels as a sham, and that the government's position was to simply run down the clock, which may or may not have persuaded some of the Tory Remainer rebels to defy the government. Earlier this week, Margot James suggested that your story had convinced her that she didn't want to toe the party line. What do you think Brussels is making of it all?
Brussels is standing aside really now and watching to see where the chips fall. There's not much Brussels can do. I feel kind of invigorated actually by this week because it's been a long time coming for two reasons really. One is that no deal. I've always believed that Brexit needs to happen, but no deal is a nonsense for two reasons. Number one is no deal just leads to a deal, right? But it's a deal that you do from your knees. When you talk about the success and failure of these negotiations, the failure is a result of the fact that the EU has more leverage than we do. And if we think that a no deal is an end to itself, it strikes me that's a complete nonsense. And I'm pleased actually that and I appreciate this might not be House line, but I'm pleased that Parliament has decided that no deal would be completely self-defeating. I also think that Tim is right that the Downing Street thinks that the threat of no deal is the way to get a deal. The trouble is they are wrong about that. And the reason is this. What Boris Johnson is offering, essentially, is a trade border in Ireland. What he's doing is saying either you have a no deal, which puts a border in Ireland, or you avoid having a border in Ireland tomorrow, and you accept that by the trade negotiation, we're going to end up with a no deal at the end of the negotiation, at the end of the transition period. And he thinks that when confronted with this reality, the Irish government and the EU will go, well, in that case, we better bin the backstop, abolish it, as you say, and give you that deal. I really fundamentally believe he is wrong about that. The Irish government, and think about this, would an Irish Prime Minister, given the choice between a trade border in Ireland in which he acquiesces in the repartition of Ireland, or a trade border at the end of 14 months, there's no way that the Irish Taoiseach is going to participate in that. So perhaps then Dominic Cummings, David Davis, Sir David Davis thinks that, OK, well, if Leo Varadkar won't agree to a trade border in Ireland, the EU will make him because they fear a no deal enough. Well, wrong again. The Irish government has agreed to protect the single market. Simon Coveney, the Irish Foreign Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, said yesterday that he would do the customs checks. So the EU gets its protected single market and it doesn't get to throw the Irish under the bus. And the EU is a collection of medium-sized member states who have their clout from acting together. And so for those two reasons, I think actually, we are in a better place now. We are moving towards a place where those realities are going to be confronted.
Although, of course, with the, let's call it the rebel no deal bill that has just passed through both houses, the Lords abandoned their opposition to it in the early hours of Thursday morning because a deal had been struck between Spencer, the government chief whip, and we believe the Labour opposition chief whip, to support a fixed-term Parliament Act motion, a second motion now, on holding an election on October the 15th. And we understand now from Jacob Rees-Mogg, leader of the House, that vote will take place on Monday after the bill has got royal assent. Having said that, as an amendment to that bill, the Kinnock amendment went through by accident yesterday because there weren't any tellers in the division lobbies. And so by parliamentary convention, by default, that bill has been amended according to Kinnock. If you read the Kinnock amendment, it states that the Prime Minister must go back to the EU and seek an extension in return for taking a withdrawal agreement back to Parliament. Lots of people have interpreted this as it having to be Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. But is there not a little bit more flexibility with that legislation now, Tim? Because he's able to go to the EU and say, well, I can't get an extension unless I get a deal. What position does that put him in? Does that mean that the EU gives him just the worst deal possible and he has to bring it back? And then it gets voted down again. And then, by the way, what happens?
That's long been the government's fear, Camilla. And that's precisely why the government has tried to stick to a deadline and hang everything on that, and to stick with the nuclear option of we'll just walk away, because we cannot go to the EU and start by saying I have to come back with something. And of course, that deal, whether it is a slightly rejigged Theresa May deal or Theresa May's old deal, that deal was rejected 3 times by the Houses of Parliament. This is one of the things that many readers and listeners will be tearing their hair out over, is how can Remainers keep saying we want a proper deal, we want to avoid a no deal situation, which they're given the choice to do that 3 times. And it wasn't Boris Johnson who prevented that from happening, because on the third go, Boris Johnson voted for it. Boris Johnson eventually said, I'm worried we might get no Brexit at all, so I'm going to back Theresa May's deal. It was a combination, yes, of very hardline Eurosceptics, but also the Labour Party and many Remainers who said no to the grand deal, the grand compromise.
I agree. I mean, plague on both their houses, this negative coalition of people who wanted to stop Brexit and people who only wanted this ultra-pure Brexit has actually stopped you getting a workable Brexit, which actually we all needed. Boris Johnson was right when he said on the hustings, we all need to move on, and God knows we do, but not at the expense of Northern Ireland.
So when Boris Johnson addressed the 1922 Backbench Committee, I think on Wednesday, he told MPs, when he justified the fact that these rebels have been stripped of the whip. And of course, we've had all of this talk about how can Winston Churchill's grandson, Sir Nicholas Soames, no longer be a Conservative, and all the rest of it, and all of these MPs who are facing deselection. He was robust with them because he wanted to instill party discipline, right? He wanted to change the system that Theresa May had reigned over, where anyone could do whatever they like. We remember Gavin Barwell, her own chief of staff, advising actual Tory ministers to vote against the government on legislation, and they just got away with it. But then presumably the implications of that are that, okay, the Remainers have been squared off, the swamp has been drained or not, goodness knows what the consequences are for the party. Certainly MPs aren't happy about it in the tea room. What's going to happen next? Number 10 is going to go after the Brexiteers and ram a deal down their throats to say you have to support the government line or you're out?
Well, it's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I do think if you've reached a position where, as a Tory MP, you're going to stop your government having control of the business of the House, you are in a pretty untenable position. And I'm not sure how you could have an election campaign when you have either it was going to be Steve Baker and his boys who were going to be thrown overboard, or it was going to be Philip Hammond and his boys who were going to be thrown overboard. I mean, it seems to me that there was an inexorable process to going forward. I mean, in terms of where we end up, let's say we have we will have an election. I think, on balance, probably quite likely after the 31st of October, the way things look at the moment. Would you agree?
Well, the Labour position yesterday, even though you've got the faction of Sir Keir Starmer and the Blairite Remainers saying we need to delay an election for as long as possible, we understand that Mr Corbyn's position, backed up by his Eurosceptic advisor Seamus Milne and others in the office, and no doubt buoyed by Len McCluskey, who wants to avoid a second referendum at all costs, wanting the election to be earlier rather than later for fear of being the chicken that he's been branded by Boris Johnson. I mean, what opposition leader runs scared of the earliest opportunity to bring the government down?
And an opposition leader, he would say, who wants to first of all ensure that Britain does not at any point in this process accidentally slip out of the EU without a deal. I mean, so he would say an election, yes, but not an election on any terms, to which the government would say, but we're going to set a date, and that date will be prior to October the 31st, to which the opposition replies, but we don't trust you. And it's very interesting to see how this word trust keeps coming up time and time again. The opposition, including opposition within the Conservative Party, is trying to turn Boris Johnson into the issue. The Dominic Cummings strategy is to make the next election all about Brexit. Well, I bet that the opposition to the Tories is going to try and make the issue all about Boris Johnson and the question of trust, which is why the decision of Joe Johnson to leave the Parliament feels so politically significant. But if I can just quickly say on the point about the rebels who have left and have been deselected, if Boris Johnson is going to hold a crash election simply to return with a majority that will empower him to go to Brussels and negotiate something, he could not run the risk of returning a majority that doesn't have a majority of levers within it, if that makes sense.
So he needs to do a pact with Nigel Farage?
Well, he needed, first of all, to purge die-hard opponents of a no-deal Brexit, and then he needed to think about how do I win over the Brexit Party people, either through an official alliance or through simply being so hard no-deal style Brexit that all the Brexit Party people support him. But to all those who say, I can't believe he kicked out Soames and all this sort of thing, he couldn't not do it.
I think that's right. I just think, Camilla, I mean, I do think Tim's right there. And so now we're going to have a scenario, sake of argument, that we get this election and Boris Johnson comes back with a majority of 50 and he's got, as Tim says, a core, trust in the fact that these people are back to no-deal Brexit. He will then have to go back to Brussels and we will then see whether or not the things he's taken off the table, remember when he made his first statement to the House, the time limit to the Irish backstop, the exit clause, come back on the table. Because I go back to my original point. If he goes to Brussels and says, well, I have got a majority for 50 and it's a majority for a deal, but bin the backstop, or it's no deal, I don't think the EU will bin the backstop. And
so
then,
even if he has a large majority secured by whatever means we've just discussed, including if Dominic Cummings can bring himself to allow it, a pact with Nigel Farage to not put opponents against each other in Leave constituencies, for instance, even if he has a huge majority and therefore a massive mandate to deliver on whatever Brexit he feels honours the referendum result, Brussels still won't accept it. Is that what you're saying, Peter?
No, Brussels will say that what Emmanuel Macron said when Boris Johnson went to Paris, that the backstop is there to ensure the stability of Ireland. Because what Boris is saying is, I want to take the entire UK out of the customs union single market. I want a basic Canada Dry FTA, but I do not want a border in the Irish Sea. What that means is, I want a trade border in Ireland, and I think that trade border isn't a big deal. It's what Daniel Moylan, his advisor, says. It's the Paul Bew policy exchange view. And I can tell you, the Irish government will say, borders only operate with consent, because that border, even if it's set back from the wiggly line, is going to impose cost. It's going to impose cost frictions. It's going to have people filling out customs forms.
This is where one scenario comes in, which is that he returns with his majority and he doesn't have to rely on the DUP anymore. So he strikes a deal which effectively permits a customs union within the island of Ireland, but doesn't put Britain in it. So the backstop is just the Northern Irish border.
So the EU are clear. You go back to a Northern Ireland only special arrangement. Fine. But, you then open a serious can of worms, which is, you remember when that arrangement first emerged in December 2017, who was straight on the horn?
SNP. Right.
Nicola Sturgeon saying, well, hang on, if Northern Ireland's got a dual-track single market Brexit, and this English Brexit is going to be a frictionful, free trading, where's our?
Where's our independence?
And the entire argument during the Scottish referendum was Scotland cannot afford to go it alone. We wouldn't want a border with Scotland and England. And yet here, the British government would be signing up to the same arrangement. But I think that's a political risk you take.
Well, maybe, because I do think there's a really fundamental point that the idea that a British government is going to impose a trade border in Ireland. Remember, all of those constituencies, I've spent time in South Armagh, in Londonderry, all of those constituencies vote Sinn Féin. All of them. The idea, imagine the Dover-Calais border. That's going to be hard work. All the small businesses working out which forms they've got to fill in order to get their customs, rules of origin forms, etc. But that's a border where everyone's trying to show up to the border with the correct paperwork. In Northern Ireland, you've got a constituency that is actively wanting to thwart the border. When Boris is saying, well, we're in a no deal and let's have some blitz spirit and everyone get to it, they're going to be actively looking to frustrate the border. No border in the world operates without the consent of the people who use it. And so, I think this is what I go back to my original thing. It's a massive structural misconception in the way Dominic Cummings, David Frost, Boris Johnson think the EU works. I can speak, I really have spent a lot of time. I think we misunderstand the politics of Ireland, the political imperatives in Ireland and in the EU to give ground on that. Now, if we get back to talking about time limits, and it's a choice between no deal on the 31st of October or whenever this conversation happens, and a 5-year, 8-year time limit. Now, the Irish would hate that, but it would be a much tougher conversation between Leo Varadkar and Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron, who will be saying, okay, we don't want a no deal tomorrow, but come on. 5-8 years, that's a long time, a lot of space for Northern Ireland institutions to be got up.
But Peter, Boris has said no to the backstop. It's got to go.
And equally...
So this is why Geoffrey Cox... Camilla, sorry, Tim, but this is why, in Geoffrey my story,
Cox,
that we published on Tuesday morning, the Attorney General... Boris Johnson said in the meeting of the 1st of August in the Brexit War Cabinet Committee, I want to abolish the backstop. Exactly what Tim's just said. And Geoffrey Cox said, that's a complete fantasy. And he's right, by the way. And it will lead to a no deal. And he's right, by the way. Although Boris, I understand now, says Geoffrey Cox has changed his mind. I can't speak for Mr. Cox, but he was right then.
We'd love to speak for Mr. Cox, although we don't have the theatrics or the Shakespearean accent. Having said that, what we come back to here then, Tim, is... potentially this. The only way that the Tories can win a majority at this snap general election is to go absolutely for Brexit. We're the party of Brexit. We're the party of no deal. Forget Nigel Farage. If you want Brexit to be delivered, do or die. We're the party that prorogues. We're the party that pushes out Remainer traitors. Come with us. By the very definition of that sort of victory, and if it is propelled by some Farage pact, goodness knows whether it would be, but if it is, then that effectively means that a deal is dead because the majority of the party will be Brexiteers who will not support anything other than a deal without a backstop in it anyway.
This is electoral logic. The number one job of a government is to stay in government. The number one job of an opposition party is to try to get into government. And everything that Boris has done, I don't think is necessarily the product of strategy so much as it's almost Darwinian common sense. That this is you look at the map, you look at the numbers. Both coalitions are currently split. The Remain one between Labour and the Lib Dems, the Tory one between the Brexit Party and the Conservative Party. If the Brexit coalition can coalesce while leaving the other one split, then it wins, and it wins a big majority. And that's simply what you have to do. And don't forget that the alternative is Corbyn, or a Corbyn-led coalition, or a coalition with Corbyn in it. So you've also got some traditional Tory reasons for wanting to see that happen. You're right, though. The logical conclusion to that, then, is you adopt a policy which is completely unacceptable to the EU and leads eventually to crashing out. Now, the government would say it is preparing for that. It's putting money into finance for that. And very interesting that on Wednesday, the Bank of England slightly downgraded its prophecy of doom if Britain leaves without a deal. And it said it's downgrading it on the basis of preparations made. Well, who knows? It turns out that if you actually spend money on ports and the borders and everything, then it reduces the economic impact of a no-deal Brexit. So they would say they're preparing for it, but they would also say... Again, we come back to just sheer logic here. We cannot get a renegotiated deal, and Parliament has said no to the old deal. We cannot even begin to renegotiate unless we have this threat of being willing to walk away. So who knows if the EU will ultimately say yes or no? Who knows what will happen? It's a massive gamble, but this is the only gamble. And at this stage, and I'm not quite sure how we got here. It'll require a great historian in 100 years' time to explain it. At this stage, this is probably the only route to Brexit left.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it, Peter? Because it is a gamble. And throughout the leadership campaign, Boris Johnson very much positioned himself as the high-risk, high-reward candidate. And I remember going around to some of the hustings and I was thinking to myself, goodness me, if I was a Brexiteer, I would simply vote him in because he has got the most to lose if he doesn't deliver this. And yet... when the stakes are this high, huge gambles are made. And is there now the suggestion that he and indeed Cummings, and let's touch again on your scoop, are grossly overplaying their hands here?
They are. And you're seeing the consequences of it. I mean, this whole no-deal strategy. So a no-deal is perfectly manageable and it's not too bad when it's to the Brits. And yet it's so terrifying it's going to make the EU cave. Which is it? Is it so terrifying the EU are going to cave, or is it perfectly manageable? Because I tell you what, in a no-deal world, if you want to think about the Bank of England downgrading the pain from 8% of GDP loss by 2030 to 5%, still not a great number, still not exactly a sunny upland. If you're a EU business or company, you have 26 other options inside the single market, borderless, friction, paper-free, in order to reorientate your supply chains. But
this is why active government policy matters. After a no deal, the government wouldn't literally do nothing. It would have to pursue new markets.
No, Tim,
it
wouldn't.
To adopt economic policies.
But Tim, this
that would make up for the loss of trade.
But Tim, this is the nonsense. 43% of our exports go into the European Union. And those other markets, the trade deals that they talk about, they can't do them until they have a trading relationship with the EU, because I can tell you, look at Liam Fox's hopeless attempts to roll over the trade deals. Why did Canada pull out of the rollover? Because they won't do it until there's a trade deal with the EU. So this nonsense that you can have a no deal to end Brexit is total rubbish. You do a no deal and you will immediately go into a trade negotiation with the EU, without which you won't be able to do any of your trade deals.
Peter, you're suggesting, Harry, that rather suggests that we're going to erect a Berlin-style wall around Britain. We will continue to trade with Europe. We'll just trade with tariffs. And again, with active government policy, they can compensate for those tariffs. It's jolly expensive and it's not a long-term solution. But the idea that we literally the day after cease selling broccoli to Germany is not true.
No, we will. I didn't suggest that we would. But you were suggesting that the government would compensate for the lost business and the friction by doing trade deals with other countries. And I ask you, look at the record of Liam Fox's rolling over trade deals. And I ask you to find me a serious trade expert who'll tell you can go and do those deals with the United States or anybody else before you've sorted out your trade relations with the EU. And this is the total and utter nonsense, is that Boris Johnson says he wants to get Brexit off the front pages and get rid of Brexit. And no deal does precisely the opposite. The only thing that gets Brexit off the front pages now, is to get into a transition period. And the only way to get into a transition period, which is a legal standstill that puts a roof over your head while you rewire a relationship of 46 years, is to do a deal.
Having said that, there's a great fear among Tories that if you enter into a transition period, you then have the likes of Nigel Farage, if no pact has been struck, shouting from the sidelines, we're still in the EU, we're still in the EU, this lot haven't delivered, this lot haven't delivered, and having a real go because Conservative voters will not really feel that Brexit has been properly fulfilled. They'll feel it's been in some way fudged, that we're stuck in what Rees-Mogg and others have famously described as vassalage and limbo and brino and nowheresville. It's like Brexitosis, I think it was described by the Prime Minister at some point. And actually we haven't left, and then it will be used as a stick with which to beat the Conservatives if the Conservative Party is still intact at this point.
We're not going to leave even if we leave. We can be
We're
a sovereign...
not leaving even if we leave.
Do you know what? So
Peter Foster, what is this nonsense?
So here's a dirty little secret, right? Is that if you read the EU's communications, which I realise is a novel exercise in most of our government, they are very clear that we want a Canada-style trade deal, right? But if we want that kind of market access, the EU will request a whole load of what they call level playing field guarantees, right? So that this idea that somehow we're going to be, I find this idea of being free completely,
Here's the problem with the last 3 bloody years.
Can I just say that Tim Stanley has taken off his glasses?
Yes, that's not a good stand.
Come on, we need to nail this down. Because of a complete lack of political leadership in this country, particularly from the leaders of the Conservative Party, we have lost sight of what leaving the EU means. Leaving the EU is a rebellion against the political EU. It's not about saying we don't trade with the continent. It's not about saying we don't have a trade deal with the continent, which of course involves level playing fields. America, Mexico, and Canada have a massive trade agreement, NAFTA. It involves level playing fields. It requires no freedom of movement and no membership of a parliament, and certainly no deference to each other's courts. That's what we mean by leaving.
You pretty much just described Theresa May's deal. That's the kind of absolutely bonkers thing here.
Where is the
equivalent of the backstop within NAFTA?
Where
is the equivalent secession of sovereignty and self-government that translates into? But for most people, it's very simply they want an EEC-style relationship. They want to trade, but they don't want to be part of this massive political project. So we can continue to trade, and the fact that we sign up to a trade agreement in which, surprise, surprise, we say we'll have the same quality of lamb, it doesn't mean we've made any great sacrifices.
Peter, you do have to admit that at the time the withdrawal agreement came out, I know there were a lot of proponents for it, and indeed a great many MPs voted for it, just simply not enough. There were criticisms from lawyers on both the Brexit and Remain side of the argument that the withdrawal agreement basically meant that we would continue to have to be a rule taker rather than a rule maker, and that it was actually equivalent to worse than being in that respect. Although, admittedly, it may well have delivered on the promise of political divergence from the EU.
So we are going to be a rule taker. Do you know what? The one thing the EU is a superpower at is trade. The reason the US want us to take chlorinated chicken, etc., is because it drives them nuts that the EU is a trading bloc. If you make cosmetic or chemicals in the US, you make them to EU standards because that's the global standard. So we are going to be a rule taker. Right? The backstop, which is obsession with it, is there to stop a return to borders of the past. And I am frankly staggered that the collective amnesia and the absolute abrogation of responsibility of this government to Northern Ireland. I frankly
there is
find
a history of this country prior to 1973, Peter. There is a history of this country prior to 1973 in which we weren't members of the EEC, but we still had free movement within the island of Ireland.
So it's not about free movement of people. The common travel area has already been agreed. I think, you know what, you use a telling phrase there, the EEC. What you sort of think, I think, is that we ought to go back to having a free trade area. But the EU is a single market, and modern economies are actually more about services than goods. And so the reality is people thought they joined a free trade area, and after Maastricht it morphed into a single market. And leaving a single market is different from, and dealing with a single market is different than dealing with a free trade area.
Well, this 30 minutes has absolutely flown by, so we have to bring this very animated discussion to a respectful and dignified close, chaps. Tim, Peter, thank you. I'm going to ask you one last question, which requires a yes or no answer only. We don't want any political prevaricating, please. Just yes or no. Are we going to Brexit on October the 31st? Tim?
Maybe.
Peter?
No, Camilla.
And on that bombshell, we'll leave you with it. Thank you for listening to Chopper's Brexit Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to the podcast producers Theo Leludis and Elliot Lampert. And if you're all caught up on Chopper's Brexit Podcast, listeners, you can get 30 days access to the Telegraph online completely free at telegraph.co.uk/Chopper. Don't forget that you can come and see Christopher Hope record a live Chopper's Brexit podcast alongside lots of other brilliant political podcasts at Podcast Live on Saturday, the 5th of October. Go to podcastlive.com for tickets and use the code, all in capitals, Chopper10 for 10% off. Chopper will be back next week with his regular edition of the podcast. Thank you so much for listening.